Hi, everybody. My name is Mark S. King, and I am very excited to welcome you to one of our occasional interviews with filmmakers as part of Out on Film, everyone's favorite LGBTQ film festival, and named one of the best film festivals in the country, by the way. So we're glad to have you here, and I'm glad to say hello to Matt Nadel, who is one of the filmmakers whose film Cashing Out will be screened on Monday, September 30th at 7 p.m. at the Midtown Arts Cinema here in Midtown Atlanta. Matt, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
You're welcome. I was lucky enough to preview screen your movie the other day. It brought back a lot of memories.
I'm sure.
I am a long-term HIV/AIDS survivor, diagnosed in 1985, and I'm very familiar with the topic of your film. Could you first just tell us, define for us, the nature of viatical settlements, which is the topic of your film?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, the center of our film is this industry that emerged in the early days of the AIDS epidemic called the viatical settlement industry. I feel sort of silly saying this to you, Mark, because you know this area so well. But for anyone watching, at this time there were lots of people who were getting sick and needed money but couldn't work. But many of them had life insurance policies, many through their old jobs, or maybe they just were, wise years ago and took one out. So this industry emerges where you can sell your life insurance policy to an investor, get a cut of your own death benefit to use while you're still alive. And then when you die, the investor makes the rest of it as a profit. So it's sort of a ghoulish 877 cash now.
Yes, indeed. So you're basically signing away your life insurance policy to this company or group of investors or what have you, and they are rolling the dice that you will die soon enough for them to take the rest of the benefits that you haven't taken. And what that amount is, I guess, was a formula based on how sick you were and what your life expectancy was. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And there's some pretty unbelievable archival footage that we were able to track down that we include in the film that relates to this. But yeah, I mean, different firms had different formulas, but they essentially took your T cell count, which indicates sort of the stage of illness, a doctor's life expectancy. Sometimes they would send their own doctor to evaluate you. And use that to sort of factor when they thought you were most likely to die. And, if they thought you were going to die in 2 or 3 months, they might give you 80% of your policy to use up front. Whereas if it seemed like you were going to die more like 2 years, it might be much, much lower than that. So it's they have to factor in risk like any investment, but it feels very different as a viewer and as a somebody who's in some ways outside of that direct history, to look at it when the thing that you're sort of betting on is people's lives and death.
And you use the word ghoulish, not me. You use that word, and you have a personal connection to this, which makes the film even more intriguing, and that is the fact that your dad started one of these companies buying the life insurance policies of people living with AIDS. Is that right?
Right. Yep, that's right. My dad was one of the early investors in this industry. And, he is how I learned about this industry, which in and of itself shocked me. I mean, I'm a pretty curious gay guy who likes to know a lot about queer history, and specifically about the history of the early AIDS epidemic, but I had never heard of it.
Mhm.
It sort of came about. I
Now,
was
were you a little kid? I don't know how old you are. Were you just a little kid when he started doing this, or what?
he started doing this before I was born.
Oh, wow. Oh,
I
my
was
God, I'm old. I'm old. Okay.
I was born into a family that had already made some money on this. It was, in some ways my childhood was bankrolled by this money. And now I'm gay, which gives me an additional sort of connection to, I mean, not now, I was gay the whole time, but
Yeah.
um, me being gay gives me an additional connection to this history. And, I think like a lot of queer people, there's a sort of weird like double ancestry. where we descend from the queer people who came before us and the wonderful fights that they led, but we also descend from our biological families who, in some cases, you know, perpetrated or were complicit in, or in my case, profited off of uh, the suffering and death of queer people. So, part of the motivation for this film was me sort of reconciling uh, those two lineages, and figuring
Yes.
through my own story, what's going on here. What do we make
Well,
of?
now, and to be clear, your father is not gay. Your father is a heterosexual man who found himself in this industry. Um, I wonder if it gave him more compassion, more empathy, more insight into at least gay men and the lives and deaths that they were leading during that time, and whether or not that was a factor at all in how he was able to accept you as a gay man, or was he scared to death you were going to die of AIDS because that was the only exposure he had to gay men?
It's such a good question. I mean, I asked him this when we were filming and when I interviewed him for the film because he's in the film. My dad, he was a straight guy in Florida, which is where I'm from. And as he says in the film, he didn't have any friends who were dying of AIDS. He didn't have much of a personal connection. It was this business that gave him his first peek into the gravity of the epidemic. And he talks about um, talking on the phone with folks whose policies he bought, hearing them talk about everything they wanted to do with the money, their dreams for the next couple years, only for them to die very soon after. And I think it really did sort of rock his consciousness. I mean, he's always been sort of a like free enterprise kind of guy. And he doesn't say pull yourself up by your bootstraps in the film, but he comes pretty close. Um,
Hmm.
and I
Hmm.
think the number one thing this work did, and revisiting it in the film did, was give him pause on some of those political beliefs where he was like, you know what, actually, maybe this is a place where the government really needs to step in for people. People shouldn't have to sell their life insurance just to live, especially if they have a terminal illness. So, I mean, that's the number one takeaway for him, I think.
Hmm.
Number two, I think this did give him a lot of exposure to gay men, a lot more than he had ever had before, and to their humanity, again, to the love that they shared with their partners, the dreams that they had for what they wanted to do, the house they wanted to buy, the vacation they wanted to go on. And he never brought this work up when I was a kid. I think in some ways he like maybe couldn't make the connection between them and me because of how scared that might have made him for
Hmm.
me.
Hmm.
But I think, that doubtless affected the way that he was able to, accept me. But I also think because he was so keyed into the business, he knew very clearly that HIV was no longer a death sentence. So by the time I came out, I don't think he was so worried about that fate for me because he knew that this business had been collapsed by the very fact that HIV was no longer a death sentence.
It's so funny. Most of us are at some point in our lives, if we do have a good relationship with our parents, are educating them
Right.
about what happened to us, what our lives are like, etc. Whereas your dad got this front row seat to the love of partners and families that are really, really crisis time during their lives.
Yep.
And he probably going in, or as you came of age, knew a lot more about gay community than you did.
It's true. And, in some ways, I asked him in the film and he didn't really have a great answer, but I still want to know, like, why didn't you tell me? Like this conversation came about actually at the height of COVID. I was back home and we were on a walk talking about this idea of maybe a vaccine will come out. And I
Mhm.
said sort of offhand, well, of course I want a vaccine to come out, but it makes me feel kind of weird that like somebody at the top of a big pharmaceutical company is going to make all this money off of an epidemic that has, a pandemic that has robbed so many people of so much money and of course their lives. And my dad sort of shot me this look. He's like, what do you mean? And I was like, I didn't expect you to respond so defensively to that. And he was like, I think we need to talk about something. And that's when he told me that he had been involved in this business and done this work.
Oh,
And
and how old were you then?
it was just like 3 years ago.
Oh my God. Are you telling me that he had this whole history of how he made a living, how he put food on the table, put you through college, and you never knew that it was
That's
through
right. I mean,
viatical settlement?
I'll hedge that by saying my dad is he's a serial entrepreneur. So this was one of many sort of yeah,
Okay, but still.
I call them loopholes and he calls them opportunities.
Okay, all right.
He,
Well, he's a capitalist, no doubt
that's
about it,
right.
and good for him. And when I say good for him, that is in fact the conflict I guess so many people have when we have this conversation about what happened to people with AIDS who had life insurance policies and how the man got a hold of their policy and gave them
Right.
a stipend, and was that enough? And people had such mixed feelings about this at the time. And what I really enjoyed about the film is how you give that nuance a lot of air to breathe. Among the people that you're interviewing, there are some really terrific figures who are your profile subjects in the film. They include Steve, who is created a viatical settlement company of his own because his own partner was dying of AIDS, and they realized he had a life insurance policy. I'm sorry, his name is Scott, um, and and they saw it as an opportunity if they could somehow sell his life insurance policy, and
Right.
that began a career for him. But also Sean Strube, who is the founding editor of Pause Magazine, someone I count as a good friend. I think that one of the things that you do really effectively in the film is you do paint us a picture of early AIDS. And as a long-term survivor and writer about that period, I uh, Harold, I celebrate any opportunity for us to tell that story in whatever way we can tell it. And you do a really effective job of painting a picture of what it was like through news footage and the stories of your profile subjects. Um, Sean Strube, founded Pause Magazine while covered in KS lesions,
Yep. Yeah, he
covered in
says in the
skin
film, like
cancer.
he says in the film, I didn't know that I would be there for the first year anniversary, but even
Right?
if it were just a year, fine, we'd do it right without compromise. And it's the
Yes.
level of just sort of belief in the spirit of the community of like, I'm going to put something out there, and even if I'm not there to lead it, someone will, is really, I mean, when he said that,
Yeah.
to me, I was like, you have to be in the film.
Well, I mean, he literally was putting together issues 3 months in advance that he did not know if he would live to see.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's pretty amazing. And then he was part of that, blessed generation of people living with AIDS who were there for new combination therapies.
Right.
And we suddenly got a lease on life. And, Sean sold a policy. It helped him, as you say in the film, start Pause Magazine. And then here he is, still walking and talking, and somebody's still waiting for their check.
That's right.
Um,
One of the worst investments they ever made.
yeah, although obviously for a long time, a very smart investment
Yeah.
from a money-making point of view, right? There's somebody else, Dee Dee Chambly, who is a very well-known trans woman activist here in Atlanta. And, gosh, I hope she'll be at the screening of the film. I bet she will be. She has this moment that really touched me in the film where she is talking about the dark days, of AIDS and how she wished, and I'm paraphrasing her, but how she had this kind of image in her mind of being at the beach and
Yeah.
just being to escape to
Yeah.
escape all of this and be at the beach and just stay there until it was over.
Yep.
And that just kind of wrecked me.
Yeah. It wrecked me too.
You know, uh, I don't know. Her words are just so moving.
Yeah.
By the way, I sold my life insurance policy in the 90s. And it's funny, it wasn't worth much. I think it was like a $10,000 policy that I had left over from a job.
Right.
And maybe I got a few thousand for, two or three. It was before medication, before the new
Oh.
medication. So they still figured I was a good risk, even though I was otherwise healthy. So here I was, somebody who was otherwise healthy. I was doing all right, but I
Right.
still managed to get a few bucks for this because they were that convinced that even in the best of circumstances, people like me would be dead in a few years.
Totally. I mean, it's, like any investment, it's a betting game. And in, I don't know what year it was that you sold your policy, but in 1990, uh, it's a pretty sure bet that somebody with HIV is going to die pretty soon. Of course,
Mhm.
lots of people like you prove them wrong, and thank God you did. But that's sort of when I talked to my dad about it. They developed these sort of algorithms based on a lot of medical science because people were dying
Mhm.
on those time frames so quickly. And when the medications came out and combination therapy came out, it totally threw a wrench in those formulas. Um, and lots of investors caused a big stink about it. But
Well, and that's the part where that's kind of our only window into greed that
mhm,
we see in your film. And that is when the new medications came along and suddenly all of this paper people were holding was worthless or
totally worthless.
seemingly worthless all of a sudden. And they got pissed. They got pissed. They wanted to start lawsuits and everything. And that was the one part of the movie where I was like, greedy bastards,
Yep, yeah.
you
I
know?
It's funny you bring that up because I mean it was easy before then to conceal your motivation for why you were doing this work.
Mm.
If you were approaching it from a place of greed, you could still just say, well, look how it's helping them. It doesn't matter if I'm being greedy. It doesn't matter if I'm a genuine humanitarian because it's helping this person. They need the money. The real question is, if the investment doesn't go your way and the person lives, can you accept that that was the risk you took?
Are you
Or
still happy for them? You
yeah, are you
know?
still happy for them? Right, right. And lots of people were. There were people who went into this, I think, knowing that they could make a solid profit, but if they didn't, thank God they didn't. It meant that people were living. But there were
Mhm.
other people who didn't approach it with quite that level of sophistication. And we do include a portrait of them in the film.
Yes, of course, and yeah, and it is in kind of an interesting window, and it begs the question about, and I've always had mixed feelings about this in myself in terms of who is there a villain in this story? Is there a villain? It's hard to say because I see your dad. I don't see him as a villain. I certainly don't see Scott, the guy that started a viatical settlement company specifically so that his own lover would have access to cash to get things that he needed in his final months of life. I can't see those folks as the bad guys.
Right.
And yet I remember how easy it was as an AIDS activist filled with, piss and vinegar, talking about these bad people, big pharma, and the viatical people kind of got lumped into that, in terms of the profiteers. It's just not that simple of a story, is it?
I don't think it's that simple of a story. I mean, I'll first of all say now we have the benefit of time. It makes so much sense to me that at that time, when you all were fighting for your lives, that anybody who was doing anything but joining your fight was the bad guy. I can't fault you or anybody else for feeling that way. But this film was not made while this was happening. This film was made, almost
30
25,
years?
30 years after
Yeah.
therapy came out.
Mhm.
And so, this isn't my attempt to say to folks like you were wrong back then. It's my attempt to say, what can we learn about our society by
Mhm.
looking at this industry and the way it was operating at this time? And, you mentioned Dee Dee earlier, who is like such an important part of the film. And, Dee Dee's relationship to this industry is different from Scott's relationship and Sean's because she didn't have a life insurance policy to sell. She was a sex worker at the time of her
Mhm.
diagnosis.
Mhm.
And that dream you mentioned of her sort of being at the beach, that was a dream prompted by the idea of a viatical settlement. It was what she would do if she had the money, but she
Mhm.
didn't. So she
Mhm.
stood up and she said, "Well, why should those people get to go to the gym just or go to the gym, go to the beach just
Well,
because
we
they
went to the
had a
gym too.
yeah they went to
Yeah.
the gym too." Why should those people get to go to the beach just because they had a life insurance policy to sell, but I shouldn't be able to, and my community shouldn't be able to? And that's what, in many ways, I think prompted her to start fighting, and as she says, to sort of get up from her grave.
Mhm,
And what prompted her to become the first Black trans woman ever honored at the White House, among many, many other accolades.
mhm,
I included her in the film and reached out to her at a time when I was grappling with this question too of like, wait, shit, my dad actually isn't the villain of the story, despite what I maybe had hoped when I started the film. I
mhm,
need to figure out who the villain is, what the villain is. And I think
mhm,
the person who can help me do that is somebody who wasn't able to benefit from this and who fought because of that. And she drives us to this idea of like, well, intention actually is really important. And I mean, I think she would say the villain is capitalism. I think she would say the villain isn't any individual person in the mix of this industry, but is the system that created the conditions for this industry to exist. People shouldn't have had to sell their life insurance policies. This industry shouldn't have been profitable because there should have been a better option. That's the sort of like villainous strain that I see running through the film.
I'm with you on that. I would also add that in times when we're not quite sure, the villain is HIV.
That's right.
The villain is the virus that we should all collectively be gathered together to fight.
Absolutely.
Everything else is a byproduct of this evil little viral particle. You know?
I couldn't have said it better. Yeah, you're
So,
totally
Matt, I appreciate you so much, and I appreciate the film. It is called Cashing Out. I want to remind people that you can go to outonfilm.org to purchase a ticket to see Cashing Out. It'll be on Monday, September 30th at 7 p.m. at Midtown Art Cinema. And hey, while you're at Out on Film, consider a donation or consider looking at the whole slew of great films that they will have as part of the annual Out on Film, such as Cashing Out. Matt Nadel, thank you so much for this movie. You did a great job, and as I said, there's a lot of nuance to this, and you really hit the mark on that. I appreciate your work very much.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for running a wonderful Q&A. I'll see
Oh,
you
you're
on September
welcome.
30th.
You're very welcome. Thanks again. Bye bye.